Stephen Walter.
Hello everyone, my name is Eric Gordon.
I am Stephen Walter.
And we're going to talk to you, we're coming to you from the Engagement Game Lab, which is an applied research lab at Emerson College, where I'm the director of the lab and Steve is
The managing director.
So this is what we're going to do. Looks like we're all set, and we're getting started. All right, so the title of our presentation, Play to Plan, How Games Can Change Public Participation in Urban Planning, is loosely what we're going to be talking about today. So really what we want to talk about are small moments in people's lives that look something like this. You can smell gases from factories and see all the smoke these factories are producing. It's sick because they're harming the environment and also causing health problems to the citizens living there. This was said by a 15-year-old girl who has lived in Detroit her whole life, and this quote was ended up in the official master planning document for the city of Detroit. Or this: it's a community I'm familiar with, but I've never thought of it from the perspective of an elder. It's nothing I've really considered. I thought that was really interesting, just for the elderly woman to find seniors to associate with and have a community with, so she wouldn't have to live alone. Now this was said by a young man who participated in a master planning process in the city of Boston. Unlikely quote. And this, compared to social justice training, it was the same content but much more fun and engaging. The combination of simple activity in addition to answering and the interactivity, and being able to be creative and competitive. This was said by a young student at Tufts University who was preparing to volunteer in the local community and producing something out of that preparation that he could take with him to community organizations. So what do these things have in common? They're all games that have real-world actions that happened because of games. But not just any game, as you know, but what we call engagement games, where the game is the process itself and the acts of play are the real-world actions. I'm going to hand it over to Steve to talk a bit more.
So to step back for a second and talk about the foundation of engagement games and all games in general is play. And there are many definitions of play, but two that we've chosen here are define play as an activity in which means are more valued than the ends, and something in which there's an experience that is non-literal, imaginative, and in some way marked off from reality. Whether that's entering some kind of magic circle outside of reality or bringing that and using that to augment reality in some way. And play is a fundamental mode of human experience. In fact, it's the mode of experience that we have in terms of interacting with the world when we are children. Children experience the world through play, and that's because the world presents a constant wonder to children. Everything has a certain novelty to it, and it begs children to come and interact and engage with it. So as a child, I may see something flashy over there, I push back on it, then it pushes back on me with some sort of feedback, I reflect on that feedback, and then I go and apply it in some new novel kind of way. And in this way, play is extremely similar to experiential learning. And in fact, it is through play as children where we learn most of the things we learn in life. In addition to that, play creates opportunities for reflecting upon my place in the broader world and empathizing with those who also coexist in this world with me. And play also creates opportunities for social control. It scaffolds these experiences where people can come together, form their own rule set away from the dictates of some governing authoritarian figure. So clearly play is an extremely powerful and productive force. However, as we grow older, opportunities for unstructured play tend to wane. And in fact, we are beset by a certain spirit of gravity. The world loses a sense of its inherent wonder. It no longer calls out for us to come and engage and play with it. And to perform as adult means to be serious. And if one brings any kind of play or fun into a process, they're often told to get out of the room because they're being immature. And this is especially true in civic life. from issues of government policy to humanitarian crises to discussions around economic and environmental sustainability. But it doesn't have to be this way. We shouldn't have to give up one of the most powerful tools we have in order to perform as these serious entities, these serious actors. We can still be reverent and respectful and aware of the implications of our actions in serious situations while being able to yield one of the most powerful and productive tools that we have, play. So what happens when we bring play into a serious civic life? Well, it can result in better, more nuanced and productive action. It can result in more trust, both vertical trust between decision makers and constituents, and lateral trust between people in a community. And it can also create opportunities for civic learning, where people are reflecting upon their actions as opposed to simply taking them. And this can all happen in a context of fun. But how do we do this? How do you bring play into a serious process, a process that does not call out for people to come play with it? Well, the answer is games. One of the answers, I should say. Games are like steroids for play. When the inherent interest of the world starts to wane, people create games to make things interesting again. And it's something that we understand from the earliest of ages, when we start to get bored. People like Tom Sawyer knew it. Children all over the place knew it. And though Tom Sawyer was kind of an asshole, he was also a brilliant game designer, because he understood that in order to make something interesting to him again, all he had to do was create some unnecessary obstacles along with some rules, some opportunities for feedback, and clear goals, and suddenly it was imbued with some kind of interest again. It had some novelty. And in a sense, he created a new kind of wonder, a man-made sort of wonder. And in that way, games are kind of like wonder machines. These man-made creations that bring interest to the world as opposed to just relying on the world to create interest and create these opportunities for play and bring in all the affordances of play. And people everywhere are obviously understanding the value and productivity and power of bringing play into serious situations. It's why we're all here today at this Games for Change Festival. And people are doing tons and tons of interesting things in very different kinds of ways, and they all overlap in a lot of really wonderful, messy kind of ways. But in general, I think we could put things into a couple of buckets when it comes to serious games and bringing play to serious situations. So there's learning games, a game like Farm Defenders, which is a game for farmers in Africa, and it teaches them sustainable farming practices, in the hopes that they then take what they learned in the game and apply it to their own farming. So those are learning games, and then there are things that we call direct impact games. A game like Duffer's Dying, where there's a sort of emotional connection that's formed while playing the game, and the hope is that people are nudged to kind of go out and create some kind of real world change. And then a game like Free Rice, where there is some sort of real process, real action happening through the game, though it's questionable whether or not that action would have happened otherwise. But the game doesn't really teach you much about the actual issues that the game is about hunger. And then, of course, there's gamification. What a wonderful word. So gamification is simply behavior modification. It's getting people to do certain things using the power of games. And it's actually a great testament, I think, to get the power of games that corporations like McDonald's and all sorts of corporations are using game mechanics to motivate consumers to act on certain behaviors that these companies want to happen. But oftentimes, gamification happens at a very superficial level and certainly doesn't get at levels of deeper engagement and deeper kind of learning. And at the same time, you have this game ecosystem, you have the digital ecosystem, and this thing called the internet. And with the internet, you have social media and the behaviors that come with social media. And in addition to that, you have mobility and the fact that people from developing countries to developed countries are continuing to get more and more access to the web through cell phones and smartphones and other mobile connections. So what happens when you combine the best of learning games with the social systems that can impact the world in a way that the world has never quite seen? Well, that's where engagement games come into play. The DNA of engagement games are made up of the two strands of learning and action, fused together through play. And using games in these engagement games, bring these two things along with play onto real serious situations, and through that bring all the affordances of play to various forms of civic life. And now Eric is going to come back and talk a little bit about how that happens.
Thanks, Steve. All right. So the way that it happens in the work that we do typically is to identify the real world problem and to identify the desired action. But then on top of that is this wonder box, as Steve put it, where the particular behaviors that take place between the problem and the desired action can be scaffolded through the game. So back to the idea of an engagement game. How can it enable real-world actions for the game designer? And we want to think about game designers as more than just what we typically think about game designers. It's not just the people that are coding and creating the visual design, but also the people that are working in governments, the people that are working in organizations that are actually designing the experiences or curating the experiences for people. How can it enable real-world actions for the citizen and player? And how can it enable real-world collective deliberative action? So those are the values and the actions that we're trying to associate with what we call engagement games. So there's a long history of these sorts of games. A history in urban planning, which is the core of this talk and the core of a lot of work that we do at the Engagement Game Lab. And we go back to the 1960s, and we have the work of Clark Abt, of course, who wrote the book Serious Games that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but also designed and collaborated on the design of a number of different urban planning games. In fact, Architectural Forum in 1968 touted the possibilities of games for planning. And this is from the magazine, a game which reduces the world to a comprehensible whole and gives each player the same frame of reference can go a long way toward giving him an understanding of his own concerns in relation to the total picture. Well, it seems obvious now, but it seems that the fact that it was written in 1968 about games that took place in the 1960s that were specifically about, that were funded by HUD, that took place in the United States to get citizens aware of and involved in urban planning issues. What they did, a game called Metropolis that was designed from Michigan State in coordination with Abt, was the primary goal of the game was to reduce the gap between plan makers and decision makers by letting decision makers see the implications of alternative decision chains. So simply, it was the act of empathy, but it was taking the actions that happened during that game and it was applying it directly to the planning document that was produced by and in coordination with HUD. So Clark Abt describes games as an activity among two or more independent decision makers seeking to achieve their objectives in some limited context. So games can do this, they have done this, but then what's really strange about the history of urban planning games is that after the 1960s, they seem to have gone away, or for some time anyway. They took a very long hiatus. And they turned into, SimCity became the game that we associated with urban planning games for a long time, and simulation games rather. So we associated simulation and urban planning for a while after the 1960s as the way in which people can make smarter decisions about urban planning. But as any urban planner will tell you, SimCity is not really great urbanism. There is no context in at least the traditional SimCity for the concept of mixed use, which is a real problem, really, when it comes to thinking about our cities. So in that case alone, the idea that it's not just about simulating urban life, simulating an urban experience, but facilitating the moment where people interact with the planning process. So some of the games that we've developed to try to work in this space is one game called Participatory Chinatown that was designed by the Engagement Game Lab in coordination with Muzzy Lane. And Participatory Chinatown was a game that facilitated the urban planning process in Boston's Chinatown. It was mentioned earlier in the quote from the young person who played the game. But specifically, it wasn't just about learning about urban planning, it was the urban planning process itself. The actions taken within that game made it into the planning document. So when people came into play, it wasn't seen as just a training ground for actual civic participation, it was that participation, and people knew that from the get-go. Another game that I mentioned earlier called Civic Seed, which is a game that we've developed in partnership with Tufts University that is designed to train students for civic work. But more than training students for civic work, it actually facilitates the production of a civic resume that those students use to hand over to community partners. So what they're doing in that active gameplay is producing a document that will affect their future careers, that will affect what they do in their college careers with community partners around Tufts University. Another game that we've developed is called Community Planet, which is the game that factored into the Detroit Master Planning document that I mentioned earlier. Community Planet is the largest game that we've developed and probably the most complex. And I'm going to show you a quick introductory video to give you a sense of what this game is.
Okay, well, the next item on the agenda is vacant lot number 8934.
Yes, lot 8934. No high-rises, no museums, no parks. We have plenty of these things in our town. I'll tell you what we need. A state-of-the-art parking lot. That or a landfill.
If only there was a way to involve the community in this process.
That's preposterous. I don't see how that could ever work. You're suggesting we let the community plan it.
So Community Planet has been played in a number of different cities. It's been played in Detroit, in Boston, and Philadelphia, smaller cities around the Boston area, Salem and Quincy, and we've played it in Sweden, in some cities in Sweden, and soon to be in Los Angeles and some other cities. But the idea is that what's happening is that planning departments as well as school districts are picking it up as a means of facilitating a planning process. For some reason, my display is bad. All right, so back to what we were saying before. Community Planet fits into this kind of strategy, in that it's a game that fits on top of an existing process. It's not simply gamifying that process; it's actually creating a process that coincides with an existing planning process. Clearly, the reason why we developed Community Planet is because planning, in many respects, is broken. The public participation process. And to provide a meaningful way for people to actually engage in that was what motivated us to develop Community Planet. Quickly, the structure of Community Planet is that it's composed of a series of time-based missions. It's composed of challenges within each of those missions. There are trivia barriers that sort of stop people from moving on, so there's a learning process that's necessary as part of Community Planet. And then every game ends in a face-to-face finale. So we always bring together the online process to face-to-face setting. And typically about 10 to 20% of our players end up showing up at a centralized location in the city. So the actions taken within the game. Players collect nuanced citizen data from larger and more diverse demographics. What happens here is that instead of simply saying something at a town hall meeting that goes into the ether, players are able to operate within a social system, within the structure of the game, and meaningfully understand who's saying what and how it relates to others. Citizens can create, fund, rally for, and join local community causes. And this is really what's important. The goal of the game is to get local community causes funded. So it provides people a meaningful aspect to what they're doing that's beyond the 30-year plan. Because I'll tell you, 16-year-olds are typically not interested in the 30-year plan. So actions taken within more actions. Democratic deliberation is founded on a context of civic learning, social control, and trust. And let me explain a little bit more about that. Here you see pictures of some of the game finales meetings that we've had in different cities. One of the things that we found to be most compelling in our community planning process is the involvement of youth. As it turns out, for instance, in the game that we played in Detroit, we had about 1,000 players. 50% of those players were under 18. What that created was something that was actually quite meaningful. And it's not just that we got youth to participate in a planning process, because the typical amount of people under 18 that participate in a master planning process is about 0. The fact that we got more youth to participate was interesting in and of itself. But more importantly, what was interesting is that for the adults playing the game, the presence of the youth was actually a motivating factor for their participation in the civic process. So people said things like, it was amazing to see all those kids there. It wasn't that they were necessarily responding to them in any kind of substantive way, but the fact that they were there was motivating and legitimizing the process. And on the flip side, and you might expect this to be true, but for the youth who were participating, it was important that there were adults participating, again, not because they interacted with them, but because it legitimized the process. It wasn't just a school exercise. They were playing a game and they were participating in something that was legitimate and factoring into an official process. So both of those groups together actually motivated the success of the game. Identity is an important thing too, and this is something that we've struggled with a lot in a lot of our games, is to use real-world identities as we're trying to layer, within the concept of an engagement game, trying to layer play actions with real-world actions. And so to do that, we've struggled with the idea of pseudonymity and anonymity, and decided that having the responsibility of being attached to one's name is actually really important for these games to exist. And so we've looked at this from a number of different perspectives at the Engagement Game Lab. One of the concepts that we're really interested in is this notion of civic learning, which is this idea that civic engagement is more than just taking an action in the world. It's more than just habitual practice, but it's reflective practice. And what can happen in a game is that when you take that civic action, the game forces you in some ways to reflect back on that action. And that leads to more extensive learning, and something that we're learning from our players, that it goes beyond the simple action or the simple play, but something that we can call civic learning. And ultimately, we're asking, what do playful civic actions look like? What does it mean to participate in a playful way? Does it delegitimize a process if it's associated with play? And that's something that's actually interesting. When we market an urban planning process as a game, for some it does delegitimize the process, and that's actually an interesting tension. For others, it motivates them to participate. So how do we deal with that in each of the various contexts is something that comes up all the time. And then finally, how can a game constructed facilitate these actions? So what do we do with the game after that? What ends up after every community planet game is a massive amount of data. So in the case of Detroit or Philadelphia, we had 10,000 comments that were the result of the game. All of that gets presented to the community to use if they choose, and also to the government to use, but we're running into problems where the government doesn't actually have the capacity to deal with the kinds of data that a game can produce. So one of the things that we have to do is not only build capacity of game players, but build capacity of the institutions that are sponsoring these games. And then finally, we're committed to design and action research. So research is a really important part of this, is that we don't want to just create games and see what happens, but we want to be able to learn from these games and be able to share those learnings. And we do that through a number of different methods, mostly qualitative and observational. We want to focus on local outcomes, because ultimately what happens in Detroit doesn't necessarily happen in Los Angeles, and we want to understand that as opposed to jumping directly to universal metrics. And then we also value sharing those results with the community, which is something that beyond the game data, how can we meaningfully feed back what we learn from gameplay to the communities that we work with. This is just why participatory action research is is important. And that's all we have, so thank you very much. And then we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah, so each game is planned specifically and curated for a particular planning process. So what's important about it is that it's connected to some sort of official process. So it's not just something that gets played just to be played, but that the players know that their actions in the game are moving towards something that a decision maker will look at, or that will filter into something very specific. We're working on that. At the moment, it's expensive because it takes a lot of time. But we're actually developing a curriculum that we'll put online that makes it easy for people to use. We want to get it free or cheap, and we're working on models to make that happen. So right now, as I said, we've done I think 7 games, and we have many more planned for the summer and beyond. And we're hoping that at each point it becomes cheaper to do. The curriculum should be ready in September. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about what kind of success or lack of success you had in Detroit, given the current state of that city, and potentially what has been the exclusion of the democratic process with the appointment of the city ASR city?
The Detroit process was pretty interesting because we worked with this sort of a slightly governmental agency, but not really an organization, I should say, called Detroit Works. And they were funded primarily by the Kresge Foundation and a bunch of other foundations to develop this plan outside of the city. Because of all the internal turmoil in the city, a lot of the foundations simply didn't trust giving them money to do it. And so we worked with them to develop this plan, and they undertook a pretty unprecedented engagement effort in terms of engaging the whole city. And I think that their numbers are around, like, they engaged 30,000 people or so through a bunch of different, in a bunch of different ways. And they did a lot of the on-the-ground work for us, and the game ended up getting a pretty representative sample of the demographics of people who live in Detroit. And of course, there were all sorts of issues like digital divide, language barriers, and things like that. But in general, the game, sort of in terms of the participation, was a success for Detroit Works. And right now, the plan that was generated from info from the game and from planners and from all sorts of other engagement methods, it was just released in December, and the plan is to implement it over the next 50 years. And as of now, the Kresge Foundation has donated $150 million to actually implement the plan, and the plan is built around a series of action plans that are, some of which are very easy to implement now and that they're going forward with, and some of them are much more long-term. So really, we're in the stage now where we're just following the process and trying to figure out what they're doing and trying to get whatever feedback we can regarding the long-term plan. So.
Sure. So I think you're talking about interoperability within government institutions or nonprofits in a particular city and how they don't talk to each other. That's a big problem. It's a big problem even within the same department often. And it's something that we're really interested in. And the way that most of our games have gone down is by somebody not in senior management. It's not coming from the mayor. It's not coming from the director of departments. It's coming from someone in middle management that says, I want to take a chance on this thing, and they do. And at first, senior management holds them at arm's length, and they said, we don't really, we'll let you do it, but we're going to just sit back and watch. And then as soon as it starts actually working and nothing terrible happens within the game, then they start paying attention, and it becomes more legitimate within city departments as it goes on. What's interesting, though, is we have not yet started a game where it has direct and full buy-in from a coordinated group of departments or leaders. And so that's a really interesting problem and process, but we're kind of interested in the way that the information and the idea of a game in this kind of process flows up, and how there's always a type of person, it seems, that really is sort of struggling to be heard within their departments and within their organizations, that want to take a chance on something like this, and they do, and they tend to get rewarded after this. Now, in terms of the interoperability, like them being able to share out to other departments, we've also seen sort of roadblocks there. So often it gets released publicly, but departments don't talk to each other. That's nothing that this game will solve, but it's hopefully something that this game will get people to start talking about, how they can better share the data from department to department.
And I'll also say, beyond government, the game has also been a way to engage people in government with various CDCs, NGOs, nonprofits, people on the ground who aren't necessarily associated with government. And in fact, every success of the game has been made possible by the fact that we had these nonprofits on the ground working with the city to spread the word and activate their networks and bring everyone together into the process.
We have one more question. Yes, sir.
It just looks like something that could be more generally applicable than just for the civic plan. In terms of civic planning, though, I'm wondering are any of the planned sites places where you have it be something smaller than the entire community? You mentioned a couple of small towns outside Boston, but for example, in New York City, there are things that happen within boroughs or within community planning districts, which are not the whole city. You don't have to influence over the whole structure. You have to do the entire community.
Yes, so in Detroit was citywide, but the other games, well, Philadelphia was not. Philadelphia was one planning district in the city, the University Southwest District in the city of Philadelphia. We're about to launch a game in Los Angeles, which is just taking place in South Central Los Angeles. And in that case, it's interesting because we're not starting with the government, we're starting with the school, and we're starting with a school's relationships with all the community organizations. It's a really amazing school that some of you may know of called CDAGS, Critical Design and Gaming School in South Central Los Angeles. It's a wonderful public school. And so we've partnered with them to do this game and to do what we're calling a Reimagining South Central game. With Community Planet. So in all cases, it does work. It often works best to have a smaller, geographically tighter area than an entire city. And I think we're out of time. So thank you very much for your attention.